Some began to disappear without announcing their departure. One day they were engaged in everyday conversations, lost in the noise of social networks and predictable routines. The next, something within them went silent. It wasn't resignation, but a kind of invisible realignment. These people felt the collapse of an old way of perceiving, as if time and noise had lost their density. What once seemed solid, status, urgency, opinion, began to dissolve into transparency. Amid this strange lucidity, they realized that continuing at the same pace would be a betrayal of their own consciousness. And so, almost imperceptibly, they chose to disappear, not from the world, but from the way the world recognizes itself. At first, it all seems like ordinary fatigue, a weariness the body cannot explain, a slowness before the hurried rhythm of conversations. But soon comes the realization that the discomfort is not in the body, but in the frequency of the environment. It's like trying to breathe in a place where the air vibrates to another cadence. While the world chases after quick answers, these people begin to feel that haste is merely a disguise for emptiness. The feeling of not belonging emerges as a kind of disagreement between the heart and the clock. You watch people talk about productivity, visibility, success, and it all sounds like a foreign language. What once made sense, meeting goals, pleasing others, competing, now sounds hollow, like an echo from an ancient time. The awakened consciousness begins to operate on another tempo, slower, more attentive, and from there disconnection becomes inevitable. The modern world is made of noises disguised as urgencies. There's always something to answer, react to, share or comment on. Yet those who begin to see life through the lens of quantum consciousness realize that each reaction feeds a network of vibrations that keeps the mind trapped in cycles of distraction. The simple act of not reacting becomes, paradoxically, a revolutionary act. It's not about indifference, but an inner movement seeking to reconnect with lost coherence. At this stage, loneliness is not yet complete, but it begins to insinuate itself. You try to explain the sense of disconnection and realize that few understand. Conversations seem to revolve around the same axis of trivialities: the weather, money, small frustrations. There comes a point when even words become exhausting, as if each attempt at communication further distorted what you feel. Common language cannot reach what moves within expanded consciousness. Quantum science teaches that the observer influences the observed phenomenon. When the awakened mind perceives this through its own experience, something reverses. The haste of the world ceases to be merely an external rhythm. It becomes a vibration you can choose to sustain or not. And when you decide not to sustain it, a perceptual shift occurs. Everything remains the same, yet nothing is the same anymore. The streets, the faces, the commitments, all seem distant, as if seen through a translucent film. This new sensitivity creates a kind of silent conflict. On one side, the instinct to belong. On the other, the impulse of consciousness that can no longer tolerate false centers. The superficiality of daily life reveals itself as a form of collective anesthesia, a protection against the vastness that inhabits the simple act of existing. And those who awaken feel called to leave this anesthesia behind, even if it means being alone. Not belonging becomes then a state of lucidity. The person who once saw themselves as part of the flow begins to become the still point that observes the flow. They realize that the modern world feeds on constant movement to avoid silence, and that silence is precisely where the source of all transformation resides. This inversion is painful, for it demands letting go of an identity built upon haste. The self, once defined by results, begins to dissolve, and what remains is an open field of presence. Many try to resist this process, attempting to reintegrate through sheer willpower. They make lists, set goals, try to get back to normal. But soon they realize that there is no possible return. Awakening is irreversible. Once the gaze pierces the surface, there's no way to forget what has been seen. The old belonging no longer fits, and the new is not yet fully formed. It's an uncomfortable threshold where time seems to slow down and the world seems to speak a soundless language. This feeling of not belonging is not a rejection of reality, but a preparation to see it differently. The quantum field of consciousness reorganizes perception, and what once seemed like chaos begins to reveal itself as a coherent system. though invisible. The superficiality that dominates daily life is merely a layer of noise. Those who learn to listen beyond it begin to perceive subtle patterns, connections, synchronicities, meaningful repetitions that reveal a different kind of order. At its core, not belonging is the first sign that something greater is aligning within. It is the moment when the individual realizes that the world is not a place to be followed, but an experience to be observed with clarity. And when that clarity grows, belonging changes its address. It ceases to reside in external structures and begins to dwell in the silent center of consciousness. When consciousness begins to expand, the nearby world shrinks. Those who once were the center of coexistence, family, friends, partners, begin to drift away unintentionally. It's a distance that doesn't arise from conflict, but from frequencies that no longer match. The pain lies in realizing that love remains, but understanding fades. The same gaze that once shared closeness now carries a trace of strangeness, as if your presence had become a distant memory of someone who no longer exists. Explaining what is happening seems impossible. There are not enough words to translate the realization that the visible world is only a small part of reality. You try to speak of energy, resonance, consciousness, but the words fall empty, and others respond with a mix of worry and disbelief. To them, nothing has changed. To you, everything has fallen apart and reassembled at once. This difference in perspective creates an invisible abyss between souls. It is a kind of loneliness that is never declared. You still frequent the same places, hear the same voices, but something within you observes everything with quiet distance. Conversations feel rehearsed, daily dramas lose weight, and collective laughter echoes like a memory from a time when you too believed it was enough. Now there is a lucidity that prevents a return to old innocence. Spiritual awakening carries this cost. Seeing beyond the masks also means realizing that many live trapped within them. The mind tries to rationalize the process. They just don't understand yet, you think, seeking comfort. But soon you realize the pain doesn't come only from being misunderstood, but from love that remains without energetic reciprocity. You still love, but now from a place others can't recognize. This mismatch between inner vibration and emotional bond creates a kind of soft fracture. The bond doesn't break, but it no longer holds the same meaning. Quantum physics offers a precise metaphor for this phenomenon. When two particles cease to share coherence, they continue to exist, but each in its own state. There is no rupture, only disentanglement. The same happens between people when one awakens. Conversations, habits, small rituals of coexistence lose resonance. Connection remains possible, but now it requires silence and respect instead of repetition and comfort. What makes this pain more acute is the desire to keep the bridge. You want to stay close, to show there is no madness in perceiving life as an interconnected field of consciousness. But the more you try to explain, the more distant it becomes. Awakening is a language without translation, and the attempt to translate it often turns the sacred into caricature. There are moments when the best act of love is withdrawal, not as escape, but as respect for others' timing. Over time, the temptation to fall silent entirely arises. You observe the familiar world as someone returning to a known scene, yet without the old role. The discussions seem small, certainties fragile. There is no judgment, only a quiet understanding that each walks within their own degree of consciousness. It is at this point that pain begins to turn into compassion. The suffering doesn't vanish but changes texture. It becomes less personal and more existential, as if you felt both the density of collective sleep and the beauty of awakening within it. This transition demands patience. The ego, accustomed to acceptance, reacts with fear. It wants to prove, justify, convince. But the newborn consciousness understands that proving is a detour from experience. Truth needs no defense. It simply remains. Gradually, the urge to explain gives way to the serenity of observation. And in that silent observation, love breathes again, now free from attachment to others' understanding. It's at this point that isolation transforms into learning. You begin to realize that awakening doesn't require recognition, but coherence. Being understood is comfort for the ego. Being faithful to one's truth is nourishment for the soul. Pain then changes its name. It ceases to be loneliness and becomes maturation. The old need to belong dissolves in the simple act of existing in authenticity. In time, some reunions occur, not necessarily with the same people, but with versions of them who also began to question the noise. That's when you understand that distance was never loss but space. The universe seems to organize distances so that new frequencies may emerge. Quantum consciousness doesn't separate, it only reorders. What dissolves is not love, but the attachment to the forms that once limited it. Being misunderstood in the end is part of the rite. It is the silent proof that vibration has changed, and when the pain finally fades, what remains is a strange gratitude, not for the suffering, but for the clarity it brought. You realize that to be seen is a rare privilege, and that to understand another without demanding reciprocity is one of the highest acts of awakened consciousness. After the first wave of misunderstanding, silence settles in. Conversations grow scarce, presences turn into disguised absences, and routine begins to fill with a strange space. It is emptiness, not the emptiness of material loss, but of the dissolution of the meanings that sustained affection. The old connections, once foundations of belonging, begin to feel like memories that no longer find an echo in the present. The body senses this absence before the mind can name it. There is a kind of subtle cold, as if the air around you had changed temperature. Emotional emptiness is the interval between two realities. One has already unraveled, the other has not yet formed. In this interval, nothing seems to fit. Familiar places lose their color, favorite words lose their force, and the world seems to spin at a pace that no longer invites you to take part. You try to seek comfort in old bonds, but the gesture no longer receives the same response. It's like reaching out to a reflection in water. The form is there, but the touch dissolves before it happens. Some try to fill this space with distractions, new projects, new people, new goals. But soon they realize that nothing can occupy the place of what is gone. Because what is gone was not just relationship, it was identity. Each bond that loses its meaning takes with it a part of the self that existed within it. Emptiness, then, is not only emotional, it is existential. It reveals the breadth of newly opened consciousness, but also the discomfort of no longer having a place to lean. Quantum physics describes the vacuum not as absence, but as a field of potential. It is the space where everything can arise, even if nothing is yet manifest. Emotional emptiness follows the same logic. The initial discomfort is only the noise of the old collapsing to make room for new possibilities of meaning. However, while this transition takes place, the human being crosses a desert of perceptions. There is no landscape, there is no direction, there is only the bare presence of one's own existence. At this point, the mind tries to regain control. It looks for explanations, causes, justifications. It wants to know why people have drifted away, why nothing seems to inspire anymore. But emptiness does not answer. It is not an absence that resolves with understanding, but a state that needs to be inhabited. Resisting it prolongs the pain. Allowing yourself to feel it is the first gesture of surrender to the new level of consciousness being born. Many confuse this period with spiritual depression. There are similarities: the silence, the lack of interest, the feeling of tiredness. But the origin is different. Depression paralyzes. The emptiness of awakening purifies. It is the same contrast between darkness and shadow. One prevents vision, the other allows you to see the outline of what has not yet been illuminated. In this suspended space, the individual begins to perceive nuances of their own energy that previously went unnoticed. What seemed like stagnation reveals itself as decanting. Solitude becomes a kind of laboratory. At first it hurts. Later, it begins to reveal a new texture. You begin to realize that silence has layers, that there are thoughts that no longer belong to you, and emotions that only visited without permission. Over time, the absence of old bonds turns into the presence of yourself. What was emptiness begins to fill with observation. The energy that once dispersed in maintaining meaningless connections returns as inner strength. Even so, there are days when the emptiness imposes itself with weight. It makes itself felt in the body, in long pauses, in the urge to pull away from the noise. In these moments, the temptation is to believe that something is wrong, that awakening should bring lightness and not loss. But the quantum process of transformation requires disintegration before reorganization. Just as a wave collapses to generate a new form, the old self needs to dissolve so that another pattern of consciousness can emerge. Little by little, you begin to understand that emptiness did not come to steal, but to cleanse. It removes the excess, deprograms automatic responses, makes space for what is real. At first, it feels like punishment. Later, it reveals itself as a portal. The stillness that once frightened you begins to become familiar, and in that familiarity, perception changes. What seemed like loneliness now sounds like freedom. When old connections stop making sense, the heart goes through an invisible mourning. But it is a mourning without death, because nothing essential is lost. What dies is the character that existed within the relationships, the role that sustained belonging. What is born is a presence without a role, a being that no longer needs to justify itself in order to exist. This rebirth is silent, but profound. It marks the beginning of a new way of loving, no longer out of need, but out of resonance. Emotional emptiness, then, ceases to be absence and becomes fertile ground. Within it, the ability to be whole with oneself germinates, without the demand for validation. The initial discomfort turns into clarity, and silence gains the density of meaning. What seemed like the end of connections is, in fact, the beginning of a subtler bond with everything that is. At a certain point in the journey, the desire to understand what lies beyond the surface becomes irresistible. It is no longer a matter of curiosity, but of vital necessity. The search for inner truth begins like a thread of restlessness, a voice that whispers in the silence of the night, saying that something essential is being ignored in the world's haste. This voice grows until it becomes the center of gravity of consciousness, and what was once routine begins to dissolve before the imperative of authenticity. But every truth has a price. The first is isolation. When you begin to see clearly, the collective noise stops being seductive. Conversations become predictable, debates seem to spin in circles, and the automatic gestures of daily life reveal a kind of social hypnosis. You try to participate, but feel that something artificial sustains the scene. It's like watching a play after having seen the backstage. The charm falls apart, and what remains is the raw perception of repetition. This distance is not born of disdain, but of a vibrational mismatch. The collective still reacts to external stimuli, while awakened consciousness begins to respond to internal impulses. It is a shift of axis. Instead of living to be seen, you begin to exist to perceive. And this shift changes everything, the way of speaking, relating, desiring. To the world's eyes, it looks like withdrawal. In the inner experience, it is alignment. The loneliness that accompanies this phase is peculiar. It is not the absence of company, but the absence of attunement. You can be surrounded by people and still feel isolated because the kind of communication you now seek does not happen through words, but through vibration. You want genuine contact, not an exchange of masks. You want listening, not reaction. And when you realize that most people live reacting instead of listening, the impulse is to withdraw. Quantum science speaks of coherence as a state in which all parts of a system vibrate in harmony. When consciousness begins to become coherent, everything that does not resonate with this new frequency naturally disorganizes. Isolation is not punishment, but a physical consequence of this change. The being begins to emit a more stable vibration, and this causes what still lives in dissonance to move away. It is not rejection, it is a natural adjustment of the field. The problem is that emotionally, this process feels like loss. The ego, accustomed to validating itself through external acceptance, interprets the distance as rejection. It wants to go back, to fit in again. But returning would be regression. The search for inner truth does not allow a rollback, because what has been seen cannot be forgotten, and what consciousness sees is simple and devastating. Much of what we call normality is merely a collective choreography of fear. Inner truth does not reveal itself all at once. It comes in fragments, in flashes that tear through the fog and then recede. Each new perception expands the inner space, but also widens the gap between you and the world that still sleeps. It is a paradox. The more lucid you become, the more invisible you seem to be. People do not see what has changed, but they feel the discomfort of something different, and often they react with irony, silence, or distance. At this point, a choice arises: to be silent or to keep trying to share what you feel. Silence, though it may seem like renunciation, is the only place where truth finds shelter. Speaking too much is to waste energy on ground that cannot yet receive what you have discovered. Isolation then ceases to be a wound and becomes training. It is there that consciousness learns to sustain what it has understood without needing to be validated. The search for inner truth is, in practice, a process of unlearning. Everything that was taught as certainty begins to crumble. Beliefs, identities, opinions, all the structures that seemed secure reveal themselves as fragile constructions of the collective mind. The awakened being finds itself naked before the mystery. There is no manual, no dogma that can sustain the real. There is only raw attention and the silence that observes everything. At first, this lucidity feels like punishment. The world remains agitated, people follow their routines, and you walk with the feeling of having been removed from a story that no longer belongs to you. But gradually, isolation reveals its true function. It purifies the gaze. The absence of the collective forces you to build a direct perception, free of noise. What seemed like loss becomes a gain in clarity. At some point, this search ceases to be yours and becomes that of consciousness itself. There is no longer a seeker, only the movement of inquiry observing itself happen. That is when isolation dissolves from within, not because the collective has changed, but because you no longer depend on it. Inner truth is not knowledge one possesses, but a state one embodies. And whoever embodies it no longer needs to belong, because they have discovered that true belonging is not social, it is vibrational. Isolation, in the end, is the cradle of the real. It is there that consciousness learns to remain in itself without getting lost in reflections. The pain that once seemed unbearable turns into serenity. The silence that once felt empty becomes living space, and the sleeping collective, which once provoked distance, comes to be seen with compassion, not because it changed, but because now you see in it the same seed of awakening that once made you depart. Seeing the invisible is a gift that, at first, feels like a curse. When consciousness opens to subtle dimensions of reality, the gaze changes density. The world ceases to be only what it shows, and becomes also what vibrates behind forms. You begin to perceive intentions before words, to feel the energy of a place before crossing the door, to understand someone's silence as language. This new perception, however, brings a weight that few imagine, that of loneliness. What once looked like companionship now reveals itself as an exchange of needs. Places that once felt welcoming begin to exude a rush disguised as joy, and what the world calls success starts to seem like a circular race around nothing. When you see the invisible, it is impossible to keep believing in the masks that uphold the collective appearance. You try to take part, but the heart does not consent. There comes a moment when loneliness becomes almost physical. It is as if you inhabit another layer of reality, separated by an invisible glass. You see people striving to look happy, trading smiles that don't reach the eyes, filling their time with stimuli so they won't feel the silence. And there, watching it all, you realize how much society has built its identity on the denial of depth. Appearance became refuge, truth, a threat. This perception creates a kind of existential weariness. It is not fatigue of the body, but of the soul that no longer finds a mirror. You try to express yourself, but common vocabulary won't do. Speaking of energy, presence or vibration sounds strange to those still bound to the visible, and then an impasse arises: to be silent and preserve inner peace, or to speak and risk being misunderstood. Over time, silence becomes the choice, not because there is no will to share, but because there is wisdom in realizing that not every gaze is ready to see what you have seen. Quantum physics teaches that reality is a field of probabilities, collapsing only when observed. Those who awaken to this perception live in a constant state of presence. They observe before judging, feel before reacting. But this way of existing is almost incomprehensible in a culture that values appearance and speed. The conscious observer is a foreign body in a system that feeds on distraction. They move slowly where everything runs, seek meaning where everyone seeks stimulus. Therefore, loneliness deepens. It is the price of remaining awake amid the collective sleep. Yet this loneliness is not a desert. It is a sanctuary. Within it, the gaze learns to rest. The absence of noise reveals layers that once went unnoticed. The sound of a breath, the rhythm of the wind, the silence between the notes of a song. Little by little, perception refines until it realizes that the invisible is not distant. It is merely subtle. It is in everything, waiting to be noticed. Loneliness ceases to be the absence of company and becomes pure presence. But until you reach that point, the path is arduous. There are days when the world's distance feels unbearable. You watch people seeking recognition, competing for attention, and you perceive the emptiness behind these pursuits. It is painful to see how much humanity confuses visibility with existence. The awakened consciousness sees the game but can no longer play. And this renunciation, though silent, has the bitter taste of exclusion. Over time, you begin to understand that seeing the invisible is also seeing suffering disguised as success, fear hidden in arrogance, need camouflaged as control. And this compassionate gaze brings you close to the world again, but now in another way. There is no longer a desire to belong, only the will to radiate serenity. Presence becomes an act of healing. You understand that the simple fact of remaining conscious amid blindness already alters the surrounding field. Loneliness then changes its meaning. It ceases to be isolation and becomes responsibility. Those who see the invisible realize that every thought, every gesture, is a wave that reverberates through the fabric of the real. Appearance, which once deceived, now reveals itself as a pedagogical mirror. It shows how much we still react to illusions and how much consciousness can reorder everything when it returns to the center. And at this point, gratitude arises. Gratitude for seeing even if it hurts. Gratitude for feeling the invisible, even if it distances. Gratitude for realizing that deep vision is not a privilege, but a calling. You understand that seeing the invisible does not make you superior, but responsible for maintaining lucid presence in a world that still fears silence. If you feel this loneliness I've described, this distance between what you see and what the world appears to be, write the phrase, "I see beyond," in the comments. This simple statement creates a field of recognition among consciousnesses walking in a similar direction. And if the text resonated with you, like this content, so that more people, perhaps still in silence, realize that they are not alone in this process of seeing the invisible amid the collective blindness. At some point in the journey, silence becomes so dense that the instinct to return appears. The desire arises to go back to social life, to take part again in normalcy, to be understood. It is the human impulse to want to belong. But soon comes the clash between this desire and the lucidity acquired. The world that once seemed solid now sounds artificial, and trying to fit into it is like putting on an old outfit that no longer fits the body. The fabric squeezes, restricts, suffocates. Even so, there are days when the urge to adjust is irresistible, like a nostalgia for the lost unconsciousness. This conflict is the most delicate point of awakening. On the one hand, there is the memory of the comfort that belonging brought, the simple conversations, the collective laughter, the sense of continuity. On the other, there is the awareness that returning to live for approval would mean abandoning one's own truth. The ego and the soul engage in a silent dialogue. One wants stability, the other wants expansion. Neither is wrong, but reconciliation requires courage. The ego fears isolation. It needs the reflection of others to feel real. The awakened consciousness, however, seeks coherence, even if that costs recognition. This clash creates an almost physical tension, as if two opposing forces were competing for the same space within you. On certain days, the ego's voice seems to win. You accept invitations, try to mold yourself, rehearse convenient answers. But soon the body exposes the dissonance. Tiredness comes, irritation, the feeling of having betrayed something sacred. Quantum physics describes superposition as the state in which a particle exists in multiple possibilities until it collapses into one. The conflict between fitting in and being authentic is an emotional superposition. As long as the being does not choose, it remains divided, vibrating at opposing frequencies. This indecision consumes vital energy. The inner field loses coherence, and fatigue becomes a symptom. Awakening requires collapsing the old state, choosing truth, even if that dissolves the old belonging. The danger lies in confusing adaptation with falsification. To adapt is flexibility, to falsify is self-abandonment. The line between the two is thin. Society rewards those who adapt, but rarely values those who remain whole under pressure. That is why the awakened being needs to learn to inhabit the paradox, to be in the world without being shaped by it, to act without getting lost, to speak without dissolving. This is one of the most complex tasks of spiritual maturation. In moments of greater doubt, the mind creates subtle justifications. Maybe I can pretend a little. Maybe this is an exaggeration. Maybe this is spiritual ego. These are attempts to anesthetize the clarity that can no longer be denied, but consciousness does not switch off for convenience. It observes patiently, waiting for the heart to return to the center. And when it returns, everything is reordered. Relationships that required disguises begin to drift away naturally, and others, simpler and quieter, draw near without effort. There is also a physical dimension to this process. The body feels the mismatch between what is lived and what is true. A social gathering can exhaust you more than hours of work. A superficial dialogue can generate more fatigue than an entire day of silence. This happens because the energy spent to sustain a persona that is not coherent is enormous. Keeping the mask active consumes vitality. That is why the path of authenticity, although it seems lonelier, is also the most restorative. The conflict between fitting in and being whole does not disappear at once. It refines. Over time, you learn to move among worlds without getting lost in any of them. You learn to listen without reacting, to be present without absorbing. You discover that belonging is not being the same, but being at peace with differences. Matured consciousness understands that it does not need to choose between isolation and disguise. It can simply be, and let the vibration do the work of drawing near what resonates and distancing what does not. Even so, there are moments when the longing for the old belonging returns. It is a sweet, yet illusory longing. It is not for the past, but for an innocence prior to awakening. When this nostalgia comes, remember, the purpose is not to break with the world, but to cross it without losing your essence. True belonging does not come from outside. It happens when the inside is in harmony with what it expresses. The final reconciliation is not between you and the world, but between the two parts within you. When the ego learns to serve consciousness, the conflict dissolves. Fitting in ceases to be effort and becomes a natural consequence of presence. And then, without needing to adapt, you begin to perceive that life reorganizes itself around your authenticity. What once seemed like renunciation reveals itself as liberation. What was once loneliness becomes attunement. And what was once conflict turns into a point of balance between the human and the essential. There is a point on the path when silence ceases to be refuge and becomes direction. Withdrawal, which once seemed a reaction to the world's weariness, reveals itself as an inner call, a summons from consciousness itself to return to the center. It is no longer an attempt to protect yourself from noise, but a need to inhabit the space where noise does not reach. At this point, stepping back ceases to be escape and becomes a form of listening. The difference between running away and withdrawing is almost imperceptible from the outside, but internally it is abysmal. Escape is born of fear, withdrawal of maturity. One who flees seeks to forget. One who withdraws wants to remember what they are. Escape closes doors. Withdrawal opens one. When the individual passes through the phases of incomprehension, loss, and conflict, silence takes on another flavor. It is no longer emptiness, no, it is contained fullness, as if within it there was something waiting to manifest. True withdrawal is in no hurry. It is a living pause. The body slows down, thoughts lower their volume, and attention expands. Little by little, what seemed like absence begins to reveal itself as pure presence. You realize there has always been a field of stillness sustaining everything, but daily noise covered it. This field is the space of consciousness before it is distracted. Entering it is like coming home after a long journey through mental labyrinths. Modern society confuses withdrawal with apathy and solitude with failure. We are taught to measure the value of life by the number of interactions, by visibility, by constant usefulness. In this context, falling silent is almost an act of rebellion. But awakened consciousness understands that stillness is not the absence of action, but its origin. Withdrawal allows you to perceive that every choice is born from an inner state, and that to act without being aligned is merely reacting disguised as movement. Quantum physics speaks of the importance of coherence. Coherent systems consume less energy and maintain stability even under pressure. Withdrawal fulfills this role in the human field. It reorganizes dispersed energy, aligns thought and emotion, re-establishes internal coherence. There is no evolution without this periodic deceleration. Consciousness needs these intervals to integrate what has been seen, dissolve what no longer serves, and prepare space for new perceptions. At first, this call can be frightening. The mind, accustomed to movement, tries to resist. It creates arguments to avoid silence, urgent tasks, trivial worries, distractions disguised as productivity. But the body begins to issue subtle signals: fatigue without cause, irritation without reason, insomnia accompanied by a sense of emptiness. These are reminders from the soul, indicating that it is time to withdraw, not to run away, but to realign. When withdrawal is accepted, something transforms. Time changes texture. Hours seem denser, sounds sharper, breathing more present. The external world remains the same, but the way you perceive it changes completely. You cease to be at the center of circumstances and begin to observe them from a higher vantage point, where human haste seems almost naive. It is a state of quiet lucidity, where everything falls into place without effort. In this inner space, answers do not come as ideas, but as silent evidence. Old questions lose relevance, decisions resolve themselves, stagnant emotions dissolve without analysis. Withdrawal reveals that what we call a spiritual quest is, in fact, a process of listening. Wisdom is not conquered. It emerges when the noise ceases. There is a sweetness to this kind of solitude. It does not hurt because it is full of meaning. Genuine withdrawal teaches you to be present without needing to interfere. It is when you realize there is nothing to achieve, only something to allow. Effort gives way to surrender. The mind, accustomed to control, begins to rest in the perception that there is a greater intelligence operating in silence, an invisible coherence that organizes the real without needing to be directed. Over time, withdrawal becomes a natural habit. It is no longer a practice, it is a state. You withdraw even amid movement, find silence even within sound, feel space even in the midst of a crowd. The world ceases to be a threat and becomes a setting again. True withdrawal does not take you away from life, it returns you to it without interference. And then comes the final understanding: there was never any separation between you and the whole. Withdrawal merely removed the noise that prevented you from perceiving this unity. The call of consciousness was not to isolate yourself, but to remember. The return to the center is, in fact, the return to the deepest reality, the one that was always there, waiting for you to stop running so you could finally listen. Disappearing is not a physical act. It is a silent metamorphosis. There comes a moment when the old way of existing can no longer find support within the new state of consciousness. The old world remains with its noise, its routines, its beliefs, but something within you has stopped vibrating at the same frequency. It is as if an invisible skin began to peel away, revealing a subtler layer of being. The process, however, is not smooth. It burns, breaks, demands surrender. Disappearance is not escape. It is transfiguration. There is a peculiar pain in this rebirth, the pain of seeing the old self dissolve while the new one has not yet taken form. In this interval, identity becomes fluid. Everything that once defined who you were, profession, tastes, opinions, social roles, begins to feel improbable, almost like a fiction you inhabited without realizing it. The gaze turns inward and perceives the emptiness where once there were certainties. This emptiness is the cradle of the new level of perception but also the territory of discomfort. The mind, losing its references, tries to resist. It wants stability. It wants to name what is happening. However, there is no name for what is born between worlds. The process resembles the stage in which the caterpillar becomes a chrysalis. Nothing in it resembles what it was, but there is still no sign of wings. Inside the cocoon, the old structure dissolves into pure living, malleable, vulnerable substance. The same happens with consciousness. What was once believed to be solid dissolves, and in that melting arises the possibility of a new way of seeing. Quantum physics speaks of discontinuity, moments when a system does not evolve through continuity, but through a leap. Spiritual transformation follows the same logic. There is no bridge between the old and the new. There is a leap between states of being. This leap, however, feels like death. The conditioned gaze dies. The attachment to predictability dies. The certainties that gave the illusion of control die. Consciousness crosses the threshold between the known and the unspeakable, and the body feels every fragment of that passage. During this period, it is common for the external world to react in unexpected ways. People drift away, projects fall apart, places lose their brightness. Everything that still vibrated with the old identity begins to dissolve, as if the universe were removing the stages that sustained the character. What remains is the essential being, naked before its own vastness. This nakedness is liberating, but also brutal. There is nowhere left to hide. The pain of disappearing is born from the attempt to preserve what has already fulfilled its purpose. The old world calls you back with promises of safety. It whispers, "Go back to who you were, everything was easier." And for a moment you almost believe it. But just a brief return to the old forms is enough to realize they no longer contain you. The body feels the weight of what is false. The mind becomes confused. The energy retracts. The new state of consciousness does not allow regression. What has expanded cannot shrink again. Birth into another level of perception happens when resistance ceases. It is not conquest, it is surrender. It is the moment when you stop trying to control the transition and allow yourself to be carried by it. At that point, pain changes its nature. It ceases to be suffering and becomes an alchemical process. You begin to realize that each loss created space, each silence taught listening, each solitude refined presence. The disappearance of the old is not destruction, it is energetic recycling. Gradually, the new gaze emerges. Colors seem different, sounds gain depth, time acquires another density. The mind, once restless, begins to rest in pure observation. Reality does not change externally, but the way you perceive it transforms completely. Attention becomes an instrument of creation. You realize that the world reacts to the quality of your internal state. The duality between inner and outer begins to dissolve, and a new perception of unity arises. This transfiguration does not make you immune to pain, but it changes your relationship with it. Pain ceases to be an enemy and becomes a messenger. Each discomfort indicates where there is still resistance to light. You begin to understand that growth is a process of constant disintegration of what no longer serves. Disappearance becomes a natural part of the cycle of living. In the end, there is no return to the old world because it only existed within the old perception. Upon being born into another level, you realize that the world never changed. It was the gaze that purified itself. Disappearance, then, is simply the unfolding of what was always there, waiting to be seen without filters. The new consciousness needs to prove nothing, nor to be recognized. It manifests in simple gestures, in serenity before the uncertain, in attention to what once went unnoticed, in the kindness that blooms even amid chaos. Disappearance, at last, reveals itself as the opposite of an ending. It is the beginning of true presence. Disappearing from the old world is not an end, it is a return. The awakened consciousness no longer seeks meaning in forms, but emanates it from its own being. Everything that was lost reveals itself as liberation. Everything that seemed silence reveals itself as fullness. What once hurt now illuminates. Life, seen from another level, ceases to be a race and becomes a dance. Each gesture is presence, each breath is creation, and in this new state, you understand that you were never alone. only asleep within yourself. If you have come this far, write in the comments "I awakened in silence," so that I know you have completed this journey. And if this content resonated with you, subscribe and continue walking with us in this expansion of consciousness.